Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Well, once again, we welcome you to the discussion. Connor Boyack is with me, and today we have, I think, what could be a very fun topic. We're going to talk about winning people over to unpopular ideas. And Connor, I'm just going to throw this out there kind of tongue-in-cheek. Since when have you ever perpetuated an unpopular idea?
Well, there's no shortage of them, right? I think, in the next episode that we have planned for you and I to talk about, we're going to talk about finding truth in a time of mass deception. And that very much relates to what we're talking about today, where truth is unpopular. And there's a lot of propaganda out there. There's a lot of emotional arguments that people buy into. And the rational decision, the correct response, the principled argument is often the unpopular one. And so this is something you've dealt with in your history with radio, trying to convey these ideas to hostile crowds and audiences that perhaps were a little bit uneasy with these things, and then myself in the policy role. So it'll be fun to kind of engage in some of these things and give our listeners a sense of how you and I have been able to craft some of these arguments in a way that wins people over, and then how they can do it, on Facebook or family discussions or in whatever their spheres of influence are.
So one thing I want to make very, very clear from the beginning, and I want you to chime in on this as well. Neither you nor I are claiming to have all the answers, are we?
Speak for yourself, Brian.
Okay, I don't have all the answers.
42, right? I mean, come on. No, yeah, I mean, this is definitely a learning process. And I'll share, I'll be a little vulnerable here and show how much of an idiot I used to be, where when I first got involved in policy and politics, I took the machine gun approach, and I was the Facebook, keyboard warrior. And everyone was wrong, and I was on a mission to prove how right I was. And, oftentimes I was right, I think I was right. But the tone and the delivery, the arguments I used, the emotional, issues involved, I handled them very poorly. And so perhaps I said the right thing, but I delivered it in the wrong way, and I certainly didn't win anyone over. I'm sure you've experienced the same.
Been there and done that. There's something to be said for engaging in a good argument. It is really invigorating. But unfortunately, a lot of what passes for argument on social media is a bunch of purse swinging, and somebody's going to get their eye put out eventually. It doesn't really change minds. You and I are in the business of persuading and trying to change minds, which means what we're trying to create is moments of clarity for people.
An aha moment. Well, and make people rethink about their biases or the beliefs that they've held on to for a long time. And you have to craft it in the right way so that someone is in the right state of mind in order to allow themselves to rethink something, right? We put up our defenses, we put up a wall, we dig in our heels. Oh no, I'm right. I can't be wrong, because that means for 20 years I've believed the wrong thing. And so you have to frame the discussion and hold someone's hand until they get to that point they feel very comfortable, where they can reassess what they believe and they're willing to admit that they're wrong. And you and I have to be willing to do the same. That's the hard part of all this, is that you have to be a lot more vulnerable and willing to be wrong in order to persuade someone that you're right.
This is a process that we've been through, that we're still a part of. And I guess what I'm getting at is for anybody who may think, hey, they're trying to get me to change my mind. We're not asking you to do anything that we didn't have to do ourselves. We all want to protect our mental universe. And so today we'll talk about some unpopular ideas and maybe some ways we can help get those ideas across to where it doesn't feel like we're beating people over the head to get them to accept them.
And the best way I think that I've learned to do this, to win people over to unpopular ideas, is through experience, through actual application, actual ideas. And so as Brian and I were talking about this episode, rather than keeping it at some esoteric, abstract, theoretical level, talking about ideas or in this abstract way of, well, next time you find yourself in this situation, try this. Instead, we wanted to tackle some actual ideas. And so Brian came up with a list for us of a few ideas that we'll dig into to talk about how he and I have handled them, to give our listeners a little bit of insight into how they might do the same.
Okay, so we just dive into these?
Let's do it.
All right. Unpopular idea number 1. People don't need to be controlled, only held accountable.
What do you mean by that, first of all?
Okay, so let's just take, for instance, how many laws or rules are on the books right now that could land you on the wrong side of the law?
Oh, yeah.
Who knows for sure?
The government doesn't even know.
Exactly.
There's so many laws that when the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, did a review a few years back, they could not even come up with how many crimes there were.
Yeah, we are all potential criminals. We all just haven't been caught yet. And so with that understanding, where do all those laws originate from? At some point, somebody did something or they experienced something and said, there ought to be a law. And behold, there it was.
Sure.
So the idea is freedom shrinks directly in proportion to the number of laws that you have on the books.
So you think of the case with the TSA where the underwear bomber happened, and all of a sudden now they're running their fingers, inside the waistband of our underpants, even though to our knowledge there's never been another attempt. And it's always this reactive approach. Short-term rental, for example, with Airbnb, you'll have a city where there's one party house once upon a time, and suddenly they reactively control everybody in the area in the city in response to that one person doing that one thing that one time. And so what you're saying here is people have to be held accountable, but the natural desire, the common approach for government is instead to control people. So how do we, why, first of all, let's talk about why is that a popular idea?
Because there's a mistaken belief that if we just have enough rules, enough laws, enough ordinances, nobody will ever do anything stupid or wrong.
And the flip side of that is that if we don't have those rules, those laws, and those ordinances, then
people are going to do something stupid.
It'll be chaos, right? It'll be Armageddon, and people will harm me, and babies will die in the street. And so the popular idea is this control, and I think it's born out of fear, right? Oh, we need all these laws, we need all these restrictions in place, otherwise bad things will happen. And so they're operating from a position of fear. And so this is the tough one. I'm glad that we tackled this one first, because winning someone over to the unpopular idea, which in this case is that you don't have to have all these controlling restrictions in place. So winning someone over to that idea first requires getting them to understand that they're operating from a position of fear, and second, being willing to not act based on fear. So how do we get someone to that point?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, they have to realize as long as you're dealing with human beings, bad things are going to happen. That's a part of this world. Mm-hmm. And no matter how tightly government clamps down, even in prison, which is probably one of the most regimented systems in existence, very bad things still happen, mm-hmm. sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. So bad things are going to happen. You can't prevent everything. At some point, we have to be willing to turn loose of those things we can't control. So that raises the question. So what can we do? When bad things happen, what would be an appropriate response?
This is so important when we talk about laws, because what you're talking about has led to these proactive laws where we have restrictions up front on people who are innocent. Like I mentioned the example of short-term rentals like Airbnb. There's a party house once upon a time. Now no one in the city, right, can rent their home out on Airbnb. And so you're restricting everybody's property rights because of the one thing that happened. It's a very reactive way to do it that controls everybody. What should instead happen is that anyone has the property right to be able to share their home in that way. If there is an actual nuisance, you have separate nuisance ordinances. And if any neighbor is actually legitimately impacted, whether because of traffic or noise at 3 a.m., then you have a civil remedy. And this applies to so many issues where it's better to allow for conflict resolution after the fact, allow neighbors to resolve things and resolve their disputes one to another directly through the courts where necessary, rather than relying on bureaucrats to restrict everybody on the front end so people don't have to deal with that conflict resolution. Rather than you and I as neighbors resolving our issues together. I mean, I've shared this story before in an op-ed I wrote a few weeks ago, where in the last neighborhood I lived in, one neighbor called the cops on another neighbor because their weeds were, quote unquote, too high.
Oh, that's definitely a police matter.
Absolutely, right? Pull out your guns, get the taser ready, and bring the dog too.
Roll the SWAT team.
And so rather than dealing with the issue directly, rather than creating that sense of community together where we, it's like in a marriage or with your children. When you resolve disputes, when you get over your problems, the relationship becomes strengthened. But we don't have that in our community. Everyone just instead calls the cops to enforce those front-end restrictions. And so I think we have to get people comfortable with conflict resolution, dealing directly with their neighbors, and not relying on bureaucrats to just restrict everyone's rights in the name of, keeping us safe or comfortable.
Now, we live in a society of laws, but we have to remember there are two types of law. And this preventive law that you were describing, we sometimes call prior restraint, as in that it exerts itself on people before anything actually happens, treats them as if they were going to do it anyway. And then we have protective law, which only comes into play after there is a victim, after someone has done something wrong and needs to be held accountable for it. Even back in 1978, Alexander Solzhenitsyn identified one of the trends that was happening in the West at that time that he said was going to cause us great problems was we were suffering from a kind of moral mediocrity, by which he meant we allow the law to be the limits of our moral obligations towards our neighbors. So like the neighbor you were describing with the weeds, a neighbor who says, well, legally they can't have that, therefore I'm going to get the authorities involved. That is an example of moral mediocrity, whereas a person who is acting on more noble impulses wouldn't stop there, but would say, I can see my neighbor's got a problem here. I'm going to go knock on his door and ask, is there something I could do to help? I know a Boy Scout troop that's looking for a service project. We could knock out these weeds in an evening.
And talk about creating community, right? Where you instead handle it that way rather than relying on the law. I'm going to use the short-term rental example again because this is such a popular issue right now. One of the ways that I've seen that I've had success in persuading people to this unpopular idea of not having all these front-end restrictions on this issue, for example, is to point out the fact that you can have your mom come and stay with you for 3 weeks. You can have a college kid crash, on your couch. You can invite the in-laws. You can have a homeless person come in and stay with you for a couple of weeks. All of those things are completely legal. No one disputes that you have that right to share your home for free, even if that has an impact on your neighbors, right? Because there's another car parked there. People are coming and going. Maybe there's a little bit extra noise. Grandma can get pretty feisty at 10 p.m., right? So you can do all these things right now, and I have not met a single person who believes that you should not have the right to admit a guest into your home for free.
For free.
But suddenly when there's a monetary exchange, a lot of people believe, oh, no, it's a problem. We got to control it. And so it shifts the conversation. You get people to realize that they're not concerned about people coming and going because they freely admit that they can come and go for free. You're getting people to deal with the issue of a monetary exchange being what is ruled illegal. And so then you can have a different discussion. You're putting them in an uncomfortable place that they have to defend, that they don't, it's not that they don't want you to have guests, they don't want you to have paid guests. And that's a harder position to defend. And so when you can find that little issue where you can move someone off of their high horse and put them on a much littler, awkward horse that they can easily fall off of, right? You shift the debate enough where you're arguing on your terms rather than on the terms that they feel comfortable with.
Good example. Let's take another unpopular idea.
Okay.
Healthcare is not a right. How would you respond to that?
So healthcare is not a right. Well, first, it requires defining with the other person what a right is. It's a very popular Bernie Sanders-esque slogan, right? Healthcare is a right. We should all be entitled to, having healthcare. But you have to understand, and you have to help the other person understand, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by right? And to what degree are you willing to go to enforce that right? You and I understand, and most of our listeners will probably understand, that there are things called negative rights, and then there are positive rights. Brian, do you want to elaborate on what I mean by that?
Well, I'm hoping we're on the same page here. Positive law are laws that force you to do something. They create obligations.
Yeah.
Whereas a negative one actually protects you from, an undue obligation or something that you wouldn't want. So I would say negative rights protect us from the power of the state, whereas positive ones tend to increase its power over us.
Exactly. And rights correspond with duties. So if you have a negative right to life or liberty or property, for example, the corresponding duty on the other person is a negative duty. It's not a duty to do something, a positive, proactive duty. It's a duty to abstain, to not do something. And so because I have a right to life, you have a duty on the other side to not kill me, right? And so as you pointed out, positive on the other hand, if I have a right to healthcare, that is a positive. Someone must do something for me. That's not leave me alone. It's do something for me. So if I have this right, that means that other people have a corresponding duty to do something. It's not that doctors have a duty to leave me alone. We're saying that doctors have a duty to provide care to people. And then you're talking about enslaving doctors at the end of the day. And so helping people understand the underlying questions and the ideas, I think at least clarifies the discussion. Now, I'll freely admit that if you just define rights and duties as I just did, the Bernie Sanders folks aren't suddenly going to have an epiphany and say, oh, well, no, yeah, that makes sense. I guess people don't have health care. So how do we take it to the next step? How would you say, after we maybe define rights and duties, how can we do a little bit more to win people over to the idea that healthcare is in fact not a right?
This is something I've actually used with a former coworker who was a very devout Bernie Sanders supporter. But this coworker was also quite open-minded, and the support was more out of a sense of, I see needs in the world. I see that there are people who are oppressed or people who are downtrodden, and I want to see fairness. And so to help my coworker kind of grasp the idea that you're talking about here, when a program was proposed, well, we need to provide health care for this person, I would simply ask, okay, I can see the person needs health care. At whose expense? Mm-hmm. And just by adding those words and thinking about who will pay for it, that can often make a person think about it. Well, okay, if we pay for our own health care, or if we provide for something ourselves, then I think we can safely say that that's something that we could mostly call a right. I have a right to protect my family. Okay, at whose expense? Well, I'll take responsibility for it. I'll buy the firearms and ammunition. I'll pay for the training and pay for the security system for my home and, whatever that is.
Right.
But it's not a burden on anybody else. At the time I create an obligation for somebody else, I need to ask myself, is that really a right, or is that just a want that's backed by force of government?
So devil's advocate here, right? The Bernie Sanders person will say, well, that's all well and good because you're in the top 1%, right? You're in the top 10% or whatever. So what about the poor among us? They can't assume that responsibility of themselves. So maybe me, Mr. Bernie Sanders supporter, I'll change my position where, okay, maybe I don't have a right because I can pay, but people who can't pay have a right to health care to not die in the street. How do you, Brian Hyde, respond?
Well, then I try to make it a little bit more personal and say, okay, let's suppose that you're standing at the ATM and you're withdrawing money, and I walk up to you and I stick a gun in your ribs and I say, I'm really sorry, but I need that money or I'm going to have to hurt you. And I explain to you as I'm taking the money from your hand, I need this money because my mother is sick. She needs an operation. This is going to be put to a use. The need is real. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I'm just doing what I have to do to make sure that need is met. I'd be a hero, right?
Oh, sure.
Now, typically, they'll say, well, no, that sounds like armed robbery. Exactly. But just because I have government step in and do the stick up for me in the form of extracting it through threat of force or through taxes, which are extracted by threat of force, I'm still taking something that doesn't belong to me, no matter how noble the need I'm going to put it to or the purpose I'm going to use it for. It's still taking something that's not mine and giving it to somebody else. And there's a principle at stake there about stealing.
And I think it's helpful here to bring in the essay, the idea espoused by Frederick Bastiat, the French economist, where he talked about that which is seen and that which is unseen. It's very easy to see that poor people are getting health care. You have to also focus. You have to help individuals, that we're trying to win over to these unpopular ideas, focus on the things that are not seen and say, okay, well, in that transaction where that person gets care, what happens as a result of that? Well, perhaps you have the healthcare industry inflating costs because they have guaranteed payments, and so you're making it worse on everyone else. You're causing, let's say 100 people out there to lose their jobs because they can no longer afford their healthcare payments and they're running out of money. Or they start getting fines through Obamacare because they get off of their healthcare insurance plan and then they suddenly get fined and then they lose their home and now they're homeless. So is it okay to you to provide healthcare for one person if it makes someone else homeless? And you have to get people to reconsider and reevaluate based on the totality of circumstances, right? This is something we deal with, for example, in law enforcement all the time. If you have an officer-involved shooting, chances are the prosecutor will say it was justified. Why? Because that prosecutor, his job or her job is to look at the narrow time frame in which the use of force is employed. Officer pulls out a gun and shoots. Okay, what happened in the millisecond up to that? Oh, the guy was trying to hit the officer, so the officer was justified. But prosecutors tend not to look at the totality of circumstances to say, well, wait a minute, what happened in the 10 minutes preceding that? And did the officer contribute to the circumstance? Was he boxing the person in? Was he cussing him out? Was he shoving him? And so we have to look at the totality of the circumstances. And going back to our example with healthcare, if we're not helping the individual look at the aggregate effect of what a healthcare mandate like this does, then they have a disservice. They're not going to be won over, and we're not going to persuade them to our cause.
And not to minimize the need, because I think we would all agree there are people who are in desperate need of health care or other services that they simply cannot afford.
Yeah.
So I would simply ask people, remember, before 1913, before the implementation of the direct income tax under the 16th Amendment, most of those needs were met through charity and through philanthropy. Think of all the museums, the hospitals, the bridges, the libraries that were built before the income tax was ever on the books.
Those existed?
They existed. Roads were built. But my point is, problems were solved because people were free to do with their money as they saw fit. And some people held on to their money. You know, they were miserly about it, but there was a lot of people. In fact, most of the greatest people who moved the economy and built America into this economic powerhouse were very philanthropic. And that's something that happens when government isn't intervening and trying to act as a charity.
So we should do a future episode about this with, there's an author of a book that I read. It was very impressive, and so we'll bring him on in the future. It was all about fraternal societies and how about a century ago, to solve the healthcare problem, poor people, the working class, would band together in a great, vast number of fraternal societies that, among other things, provided health insurance and life insurance in many cases. And so they could pool together and provide for one another. And yeah, you didn't have people dying in the streets. You didn't have all these problems. People got the care that they needed absent all of these government programs. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Giving people that historical context so they see that, well, the way it's done now is not always the way it was. And it wasn't so horrible then because people were getting the care they needed, can help them, reconsider and say, just because that's the status quo does not mean it forever must remain as such.
Okay, one final unpopular idea. Freedom of association is fundamental to freedom itself. And I'm going to put this in other words so that it becomes very unpopular.
All right.
You should be free to discriminate. If you are a business owner and for whatever reason whatsoever, you decide, I don't want to do business with this group of people.
Yeah.
That should be your prerogative. As long as your behavior is peaceful, doesn't matter what your reason is. If it's your property, then it is your prerogative to use it as you see fit.
So you're talking about the photographer or the cake maker not having to, do a gay wedding, or we're talking about Jim Crow South, or today, right, a restaurant in the South or wherever saying, no, you're black, we don't want to admit you. So clearly that's very easy to recognize why that's an unpopular idea, right? Especially because, people of color or in the LGBT movement, they are, very active, born legitimately out of the disenfranchisement, right? The common victimization. And so they group together, they become very active, and they can flip culture to get on their side and see them correctly as victims in these issues. So you're right. It is unpopular to say that you should be able to discriminate against those people.
Now, it has to be pointed out, though, and you'd mentioned Jim Crow laws.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it was state policy that you had to have a separate counter for lunch, for colored people to eat at. You had to have a separate drinking fountain, separate restrooms, which meant that freedom of association, I mean, sure, there were some people who I'm sure were like, good, that's right and proper. We think there ought to be that separation. There were also a lot of people who said, hey, I don't have a problem with sharing the lunch counter, that is, with people of all colors. They were forbidden by law from doing that.
And so what we're referring to here is that the laws that prohibit discrimination, or I might say it a different way, the laws that prohibit disassociation. Let's say I'm a business owner and I don't want to admit gay people into my business, for example. So I want to disassociate myself in this example from gay people. So the law in many states currently compels association because they prohibit disassociation.
Yep.
By prohibiting me from disassociating myself from gay people in this example, the law is actually compelling me to associate with people that I don't want to, and that totally violates freedom.
Forced association is the most surefire way to create resentment and hatred among different groups of people when you force them to be together. Now, granted, there are some people who are going to hold very unpopular ideas for whatever reason.
Sure.
But if their behavior is peaceful, that's their business. I knew of a glass shop owner in southern Idaho when I was living up there who was a very avowed, open member of the Aryan nations. And so his glass shop, he made it clear, whites only are welcome to do business here. Can you guess what happened to him?
Got shut down, closed.
He went out of business.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't because government intervened and said, well, you can't have that opinion and we're going to make sure that you have no business license. That wasn't necessary. The community said, okay, we'll take our glass needs elsewhere. It was the market took care of an unpopular opinion there without government having to intervene and either force people to buy from him or, forbid them from doing business with him.
And that's how I have aimed to win people over on this particular issue, because it's a policy that we've been working on over the past few years here in Utah. It's clearly an issue around the country and elsewhere. And what I've aimed to do is argue from a position of empathy, right? I would not want a business owner to discriminate against me because of, the color of my skin. Or let's say, right, I'm a Mormon, for example, in Utah, but let's say I go to New York where I'm in a minority. And if my employer wanted to fire me once he discovered that I was Mormon, what I would always say to people is I would not want to work for an employer that has that type of feeling against me because of my religion. Why would I want the law to compel him to continue to employ me when I want nothing to do with that guy? He's a jerk.
Exactly.
Right? And so what I would always say to people is, so I have empathy for that, because I, like them, would not want to be in that situation. I would not want to walk into a restaurant only to be told to leave because of some characteristic that I have. So I agree with people in that plight. And then what I do is I expand on that empathy to say, and look, let's leave the law alone. Don't use the law. But when you identify an example, when you have a real world example where, such as you had in Southern Idaho, when you can identify that there is a business doing this discrimination, I will be right beside you protesting that bigoted response to persuade that person to reconsider through the market. I'll join, hands with you. I'll paint a custom sign and go picket, and because that is the way to handle it. And to the extent that there are these bigoted responses, we should pressure them. We should get people to reconsider. But when the law compels it, that's wrong. And when you argue with that empathy, suddenly it's not saying, oh yeah, I think people should be able to discriminate against you because you're gay or you're black or what. No, that's not what we're saying at all. People have the right to be stupid. That's what we're saying.
Absolutely. And if you want to change people's minds, and I'll grant you, this is one of those areas where, wow, changing someone's mind who's decided I want to be a bigot. We all have various areas where we cling to our beliefs really, really stubbornly. Bigots are probably the most visible example of
Right.
people who are, the most stubborn of all. If you're really, truly interested in changing someone's mind, as trite as it sounds, whatever you're showing them by example or whatever you're introducing them to give them those moments of clarity, if it is done in love and if it's done with a willingness to not have to win, you just basically plant a seed in love and walk away. Let them come to whatever conclusion they're going to come to on their own terms. You'll find that does remarkable things in terms of opening people's minds.
And taking it back to the beginning of our discussion, where I was the keyboard warrior once upon a time, and I had to be right, and everyone else, that I was debating was wrong. This is a totally different approach in which I have found so much more success. When you communicate with people with empathy and understanding, when you focus on building that common bond, even if it's very small or on one random issue, you try and identify what that is, and you try and relate to the other person. You want to communicate through your humanity. So much of our debate online, so much of war, so much of conflict is born out of dehumanization. You have to see the other enemy as this non-human entity. They're just this wrong person. The guy that cut you off, oh, that's just a vehicle. That's just a driver. It's not a person with a mom and kids, or, it's not a person like you. We have to humanize the situation, which means we have to identify the common interests and common bonds. We have to speak to them as we would want to be spoken to. And I have found, Brian, I think you have too, so much more success in winning people over by set aside the issue for a moment. Let's just talk as individuals and humans. Let's talk about our mutual interests, and then let's go get into the issue now that we've established that we're both human.
So there are our thoughts on winning people over to unpopular ideas. You can check this out on our website, societyandthestate.com/6. And we hope you'll share this one far and wide. And hopefully this plays into the kind of discussions, productive discussions, that you will be having with the people around you.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.